29th of May, 1660. King Charles II arrives triumphantly in London to take the throne he has claimed to already hold for 11 years. Charles has been invited back by Parliament, the same institution that his father fought and lost a civil war to. He comes with a pledge of toleration and promises of religious reforms, while Parliament believes itself to be in a superior position to make lasting and real changes in both church and state. The path to the restoration of the monarchy began with George Monk, an English general who fought on the side of Parliament in the Civil War. With control of the army, he deposed Richard Cromwell, the Lord Protector. He then allowed the surviving members of the Long Parliament, the Parliament called by King Charles I some 20 years ago, to assemble in full. The Long Parliament had resolved that it could not be properly dissolved until its members had agreed to. With its Royalist and Presbyterian members admitted, the Long Parliament assembled for the last time in March 1660 to dissolve itself and call for new elections. In April 1660, a new Parliament, called the Convention Parliament, was elected. It had been summoned by the very Parliament that had just dissolved itself and not the King Charles. While still in exile, Charles had made pledges of religious toleration. This act satisfied Parliament enough that they declared Charles to be the rightful king since his father's execution in 1649 and welcomed him back to England. Normally, it was the king who summoned Parliament. However, in this case, it was the other way around. The interregnum, that is, the time between kings, had finally come to an end. The English and Scottish peoples gladly welcomed their king. The English protectorate under Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans had become very unpopular. In December 1660, Charles dismissed the largely Presbyterian Parliament so as to summon a new one that was under his authority. However, the new Parliament, the so-called Cavalier Parliament, called in May 1661, had far fewer Presbyterian members and many more Anglicans. In 1661, Charles, keeping his promise for religious tolerance to the Presbyterians and Puritans, called for a conference to revise the Book of Common Prayer. The conference in question was assembled at the Savoy Palace, with 12 representatives from each of the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. Several of the bishops attending the conference had either been in exile with Charles or had been imprisoned by the parliamentarians. Unsurprisingly, the bishops declared that they were content with the 1604 prayer book, but invited the Presbyterians to list their objections. The list of objections they drew up, 96 in total, was eerily similar to the petition drawn up in 1603 that was presented to King James I. However, on all but a few points, the bishops held their ground. As well, an alternate liturgy proposed by the Presbyterians was dismissed by the bishops. This led to a convocation of the Church of England being called later in 1661 to set about drafting the new prayer book. Added to the book was a right for adult baptism, as many persons had not been baptized during the interregnum. Few, if any, of the proposed changes favored the Presbyterians. The ordination rites were altered so as to more clearly define the offices of deacon, priest, and bishop, offices which the Presbyterians had issues with. This, and most of the other changes made, were in response to Presbyterianism, and thus had the effect of making the book slightly more Catholic. The new prayer book was submitted to Parliament next year in 1662. To the Presbyterians and the Puritans, it was nothing more than a vast disappointment, and they refused to support it. However, with the reduced numbers, they were unable to prevent the passage of the new Act of Uniformity, which resulted in the new prayer book being approved. This prayer book would be the longest-lasting edition of the Book of Common Prayer, and the Church of England would not adopt another version for 266 years. Many of the Presbyterian and Puritan clergy refused to accept the new Book of Common Prayer. They were forced to either conform to the new prayer book or to resign their stipend. In total, some 936 ministers were ejected from their positions for refusing to subscribe to and were called nonconformists. King Charles had 2 events added to the calendar of the new prayer book. The first was a festival to celebrate his return to England and the restoration of the monarchy. The second was to have his father, King Charles II, declared a martyr, canonized, and add the date of his execution to the calendar as a major festival. This was justified as King Charles I had been unwilling to abandon his religious convictions, especially when it came to the episcopate. Charles I remains the only person to have been formally canonized by the Church of England since the Reformation. However, Anglicanism was not just restored to its established place in England, it was also restored in Scotland as well. Many Scots detested this English kirk they felt had been imposed on them, but no opportunity came to readopt Presbyterianism. In September 1666, a great fire destroyed most of London over 4 days. Amongst the more than 13,000 buildings destroyed were 87 parish churches and the great cathedral of St. Paul's. In the rebuilding of London, the architect Christopher Wren was enlisted to design and oversee the rebuilding of St. Paul's and many of the other churches in London. This led to the mass introduction of Baroque architecture to English churches. In 1685, King Charles II died. Although he had numerous illegitimate children, he had no children by his wife, Queen Catherine. Thus, he had left the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland to his younger brother, James. James was a devout Roman Catholic. He had been exposed to Roman Catholicism while living abroad during his brother's exile. Many in England and Scotland feared he would attempt to move their nations back to Catholicism in a manner like Queen Mary had in 1553. However, James was 52 years old at the time, so many English and Scottish Protestants hoped that James would die and leave the throne to one of his 2 daughters, both of whom had been raised Protestants. In 1687, James attempted to give relief to his Roman Catholic subjects, but ran into opposition in both England and Scotland in the so-called Declaration of Indulgence. The next year, 7 Church of England bishops, including Archbishop Sancroft of Canterbury, launched a petition to halt the declaration by James. The bishops were charged with seditious libel, however, they were acquitted at their trial. In 1688, one of the worst fears of the Protestants was realized when James's young wife gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. It would be this prince, and not James's Protestant daughters Mary and Anne, that would inherit the throne. Suddenly, the threat of a Roman Catholic dynasty became much more frightening to many in England and Scotland. As well, James was on very good terms with England's arch-nemesis France and her king, Louis XIV. A move was made to invite Prince William of Orange, the husband of James's daughter Mary, to invade England. William agreed, but needed much financial support, which he got from the many rulers in the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, and oddly from the Pope. Yes, Pope Innocent XI hated King Louis so much that he gave financial aid to William in a case of the enemy of the friend of my enemy is my friend. In fact, most rulers helped William not to spite James, but to spite Louis. The result was a welcomed invasion of England. James fled from London and was declared to have abdicated the throne by Parliament. Parliament now invited William and Mary to be co-rulers, instead of Mary becoming queen on her own. For the most part, the English and Scottish peoples supported the Glorious Revolution under William and were called Williamites. However, those supporting James were called Jacobites, the term coming from James's Latin name, Jacobus. Now, one would have expected the English and Scottish churches to have opened up to their new Protestant rulers, and to be thrilled to be rid of their Roman Catholic king. However, this was not the case. Of the 7 English bishops that had been prosecuted and acquitted for seditious libel against James, 5 refused to submit that William and Mary were king and queen, and held that James was still their rightful king. Among them was Archbishop Sancroft of Canterbury. 4 other English bishops joined them. In Scotland, all the bishops declared they were for James and not William and Mary. In most cases, it can be said that these bishops were high church orientated. The reaction in England was to deprive the dissenting bishop of their sees. The reaction in Scotland was much more harsh. Not only were the Scottish bishops deprived of their sees, but the episcopal establishment in Scotland was disbanded. From then on, the Church of Scotland would be Presbyterian and not Anglican. The deprived bishops in England and Scotland had a small but substantial amount of followers. These Anglicans, called Non-Jurors, thus effectively left the Church of England for a time. This split between the Anglicans of the day was not doctrinal in any way, and as such was a schism. Regardless, these non-juring Anglicans faced persecution because of their allegiance to the Roman Catholic King James. Since the beginning of the Restoration, the High Church party had been in a strong position thanks to the personal faith of King Charles II. Even James, a Roman Catholic, had given much more support to the High Church party. With the throne now occupied by William, that changed. William had been raised in the Calvinism of the Netherlands, but for the sake of his throne, he converted to Anglicanism. Many in the Low Church party joined with William in attempting to abandon the 1662 prayer book, but he did not find the necessary support. The prayer book of 1662 would stay in place. Now, you might think that a man who was raised a Calvinist would favor the Low Church party to the detriment of the High Church party. However, throughout his reign, he and Mary appointed Low Church bishops that were referred to as latitudinarian. Why? These bishops felt that the religious conflicts and strife between Protestants required practical allowance for a latitude of beliefs, and therefore fostered a tone of moderation and inclusiveness. Well, by the standards of the day, it was hugely inclusive. Thus, with the nonconformist Puritans and Presbyterians out of the Church of England and the non-jurors in schism, a relative calm broke out in the Church of England. During this period, the English were colonizing in the Americas. In 1696, Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, ordered Thomas Bray to look into the organization of the church in Maryland. Realizing the importance of Christian education in the colonies as well as England, Bray helped to found the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge with the hope of each parish having its own library. Founded in 1698 as a publisher of Christian literature, the Society became the largest producer of Christian literature in its day and stands as the 3rd oldest publishing house in England. Bray visited Maryland in 1699 and 1700. While there, he realized the pressing need to evangelize to the native peoples of America. Upon his return, he established a second group, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, in 1701. Shortly after, it began sending missionaries not only to minister to the Native Americans, but also to the growing population of African slaves in the Americas. By 1702, both King William and Queen Mary had died and left the throne to Anne, Mary's younger sister. Conversely, the throne was also being claimed by James Stuart, Anne's half-brother, who claimed the title of King James III. The non-jurors recognized him and not Anne as their true ruler, and referred to him as the King over the sea. Queen Anne did not have any surviving children. The English were worried, very worried, that if and when she died, that James Stuart would be the rightful king. So, they did something about it. The English Parliament passed an act that excluded James Stuart and would have left the throne to Sophia of Hanover. Now, you might be asking yourself, who the fuck is Sophia of Hanover? Sophia was a German-born descendant of King James I and was the widow of Ernst August, the Elector of Hanover and Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg. She also happened to be Anne's closest living Protestant relative. In contrast, the Scots were less worried about having a Catholic as king again and did not move to exclude James Stuart from their throne. But England and Scotland had benefited greatly by having the same monarch. The English made an incredibly bold proposal to the Scots, which they hoped would continue the peace between England and Scotland for all time. In 1707, the kingdoms of England and Scotland united to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Instead of two thrones with the same monarch, there would be one throne from now on. Many of the institutions of the two kingdoms were merged or absorbed into the English institutions, such as Parliament. However, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland remained separate. Thus, at the dawn of the 18th century, the Anglican faith and the British people found themselves in a relatively stable position.